Hi, I'm Daniel Lambach, a political scientist at the University of Frankfurt, and I'm here to tell you why you should pay more attention to space in your research. Not the outer space kind, but the kind that's about distance, proximity, position, relationships, and the like. And all of this is based on my new article, Space, Scale, and Global Politics, towards a critical approach to space in international relations, which has just appeared in the Review of International Studies. Now, as a first step, I want to show how space and spaces are important for global politics. So here are a few examples of what spaces are. And the point is that they come in all kinds of forms and shapes. So first, there's territory, or rather a system of territories, the world map. This is the kind of space that our scholars are probably most familiar with. Then there are places, in other words, spaces that are infused with meaning and identity, like the Berlin Memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. Then there is scale, different levels of social relations and their interconnectedness, as in this case of a UN Blue Helmet who represents a global organization working in a local post-conflict context. Then there are networks, relational spaces par excellence, like this Twitter node map from the 2013 Australian federal election. Then there are bodies. As feminist scholarship tells us, bodies can also be geopolitical spaces. And finally, there are landscapes, including a combination of the natural and the built environment, like this border strip between East and West Germany. And of course, there are other kinds of spaces as well. If we take such an approach to space, one thing becomes apparent. First of all, capitalism hasn't led to the annihilation of space by time, or globalization hasn't made space less important, even though these are very common tropes in the literature. And I would suggest it's much better to describe these in terms of renegotiations of spatial arrangements, such as a rescaling of capitalism, or a process of de- and reterritorialization, or the power of networks and flows. And all of this is, I think, very well encapsulated in this quote by Worf and Arias to geographers who say, geography matters not for the simplistic and overly used reason that everything happens in space, but because where things happen is critical to knowing how and why they happen. And as the examples I just used underline, the where is not limited to a territorial geography, but can also be expressed through other sociospatial ontologies. Now, secondly, IR hasn't been very good at paying attention to these kinds of spaces. And I know that this is a very big and very sweeping claim, and you're free to disagree. I mean, I will accept that this is a very large and diverse discipline, and there are many research communities who have engaged with spatial questions. These are too numerous to list, and you can probably come up with examples from your own field, or maybe just read the paper or do a quick survey across different research fields. But what's been lacking, I would say, is a sustained theoretical engagement with space itself, as well as dialogue across research fields, both within IR and political science and between these disciplines and others. So to get better at theorizing space, I suggest we do what IR has always been good at, and that is nicking concepts from other disciplines. And this time we'll look to political geography and a bit of sociology. From them, we can derive 4 characteristics of a fully fledged spatial approach. First of all, an ontology of space. In other words, space is treated as an object that cannot be reduced to being merely an epiphenomenon of ontologically prior forces, and that has a meaningful effect on other objects. Second, we have to approach space as a social construct. Third, we have to think of spaces in terms of scalarity rather than levels of analysis, because a scalar analysis looks at spatial relations at different levels, but in terms of their connectedness and entanglement. Now, fourthly, we have to ask, how do spaces affect and how are they affected by materiality and ideas? And the examples from IR do the first, and some do the second or the third, and very few actually do the fourth. Now, how would a critical approach to space look like that helps us understand global politics? It's not to think everything in terms of territories, which IR has tended to do, and which would be sort of the familiar frame through which we view space and geography. But instead, I would suggest we make use of the diversity of sociospatial ontologies. And a very good starting point for that is the TPSN framework by Jessop, Brenner, and Jones. In the paper, I explained that, and I propose a set of spatial practices as a conceptual framework, how spaces come into being. And these are reification, inscription, boundedness, and relation to other spaces. And then I look at 6 different ontologies: territory, place, scale, network, body, and landscape as examples. And I briefly sketch how work in these traditions would approach these 4 characteristics. For example, looking at territory, we would say territorial practices reify territory by representing territory as a distinctive space on maps, in statistics, and administrative procedures. Territorial practice inscribe meaning onto territory through regular displays of power, such as patrols, policing, taxation, governance, and surveillance. And territorial practices impose boundedness through the demarcation of borders, their representation through symbols or material objects, and through rituals of border crossing. And finally, territorial practices clarify the relation among territories through practices of representation and exchange. Now, these are just examples, and they can be helpful in thinking through a problem from within a consistent spatial frame. This framework can also be used to explore tensions between different ontologies. As an example from my own work, what happens when we treat the internet, which is in topological terms a network, politically as a set of territories? Because then we get certain contradictions and entanglements and effects in both directions that shape both the politics and the network. Now, for all this, my suggestion is to engage with geographical, sociological, and anthropological writings on space. This isn't actually that hard because most of the authors there have been reading and doing the same kind of constructivism, post-structuralism, French social theory, and so on that we have. So there is a lot of ground for cross-disciplinary communication. And as an example in the paper, I discuss how Arctic security research has emerged as a vibrant research community clustered around a spatial approach. I won't go into detail here, so you'll have to read the paper for that, which I hope you will do anyway. And I hope that this paper will encourage you to consider the spatial dimensions of your research and see whether they might be used to improve your understanding. Please let me know if you do. I'd love to hear from people engaging with this proposal.